All right, so what's your full name?
My full name's Al Hazen.
Where were you originally from?
I'm from the Detroit area.
And how old were you in 2009?
I was 41 years old.
So, the Great Recession was, you obviously know some about it and you obviously lived through it. So, prior to the Great Recession, what was it like for you?
Actually, prior to the Great Recession, I was laid off 2 years prior, so we had a little bit of financial difficulty, and that was kind of a precursor to the Great Recession. There was a lot of job loss in advertising, and that's what I'm in. And I actually rebounded, and so when the Great Recession hit, I was actually employed.
So when you went into that job during the Great Recession, you told me after you got laid off, did the Great Recession end up affecting you with that job?
It didn't affect my job. I was actually in a pretty good place employment-wise because the layoff that I mentioned previously, I was actually able to rebound. What it did affect me with was my retirement portfolio. I had conversations with my financial advisor about the upcoming recession and about the build-up to it before it actually got really bad, and he kept assuring me that things would be okay and everything would rebound, and I was in disagreement with him. And actually, I took his advice against my gut feeling, and we don't work together any longer as a result because I actually took things back in control.
And so how did you, like in 2007 of December, like that's when the Great Recession first started, how did you first find out about this?
It was kind of a slow trickle. A lot of people were talking about the housing bubble.
And what is that?
The housing bubble was the effect of people buying and selling homes at overvalued rates at a level that was unsustainable. A lot of people were putting a lot of their life equity into home and housing, and had less in terms of savings. So when that bubble actually happened, it affected their wealth pretty detrimentally.
And so during that time, did you face any financial hardships?
No, I weathered pretty well because I tend to be pretty conservative in the housing that I buy and the savings that I partake in, and everything else financially. I do know a lot of people who were a little bit more liberal with their finances and ended up losing homes and things like that.
Did those people you knew, did they usually come back out of it, or did they?
They did eventually, some of them, but some of them depleted their retirement savings because they didn't have a traditional savings, a backup emergency fund, and then some of them, it took a while to kind of, get out of that debt that came with housing loss, and to get back into stability.
Did you notice at your work any changes that occurred, like maybe changing the hours, or like did you even notice maybe your workers, like maybe if they were maybe laid off, or you noticed troubles with them?
Yeah, there were a lot of layoffs. Fortunately, I did not get affected by layoffs because I was on a account that was a pretty healthy account. But the people that I knew or worked with that were on automotive got affected, and a lot of people got laid off.
Speaking of automotive, how did you feel about the financial bailout given to the automotive industry?
I think it was an important step, and I really don't think it was a bailout. It was more of a loan in some cases. It was kind of a hybrid. It wasn't like the bailout that the financial services received. The automakers ended up paying back some of that money. But I think it was really important to maintain the workforce and the local economies, and resulted in and a stronger automotive industry, which has helped the Midwest region.
Especially since we live in Michigan, where we're based on the automotive industry. Do you think it affected Michigan more than other states, especially maybe out farther west and farther east?
Yes and no. I mean, if the automotive industry had collapsed, it would have had nationwide repercussions. But in the immediate short-term solution, it did have local effect when it came to saving some of the jobs or recouping some of the jobs. It was still it was still very hard during that period because some of the companies went through bankruptcy, and so there was a lot of loss. But it would have been even worse if there wasn't a bailout effect.
And you were talking about how you're conservative with your money and you made sure your savings were, they're all well and everything was going okay. But did you take any other precautions, or did you go through any other procedure to kind of make sure that you weren't going to go into a financial collapse?
The one thing that I do is I pay attention to the retirement investments that I have and will allocate or reallocate. So as the recession was going on or winding down, I made some adjustments to my portfolio that helped mitigate some of the risk. When Congress was messing around with debt ceiling issues, I was sheltering some monies into areas like bonds. And then when some of that resolved, I put things back into more growth opportunities. The long and short of it is, whenever you have instability like that, you have to pay attention to where your money is placed and how it's being invested. You can't just let it go on auto drive, depending on where it's invested. So a good financial advisor can help you with that.
And did that end up helping you out in the long run?
Did what help me out?
All your planning and your precautions that you made for financial.
Yeah, but the recession probably did slow down the amount of growth that I could have had. I rebounded, but if it wasn't for the recession and the taxpayer bailout of the financial system, we probably all would have done much better as a nation individually.
And what did you think of George W. Bush's, and the Congress's reaction to this, and then compared to Obama's kind of reactions to this? Can you kind of talk about them both and then maybe compare them?
So I believe that President Bush's administration was asleep at the wheel when it came to the housing bubble and the looming crisis. And when they actually started to react, it was too late. And they reacted in a manner that was almost panic. So they were in such crisis that they had to do almost anything to save the financial industry, because that collapse could have had very, very big global implications. Had they gotten ahead of it a little bit more, they may not have been in that scenario. When the responsibility was passed from the President Bush administration to the President Obama administration, there were a lot of things that were already in place that were almost on autopilot, that were set up by President Bush's financial Paulson. His name was Paulson. He had set up a lot of things in place that Obama actually implemented, and those implementations helped pull us out of some of the financial issues that we had, but it was still at a great cost to the taxpayers.
And talked about Obama's, what he did, right? Or did you mostly just focus on Bush?
President Obama walked into the financial crisis, and he pretty much had to pick up some of the policies that were put in place by Paulson and President Bush, and continue to implement those. Now, he did build upon those, but once things began to stabilize with the financial industry, then they had to focus on, economic policy that helped regrow the nation's financial world. One of those elements was the automotive industry and that bailout, and that had a lot to do with President Obama's administration. And even though he received a lot of criticism about that, I think that's been viewed as a success as we look in hindsight. The financial crisis that came, there's still a lot of concern about the cost that problem gave to our nation, and how we may avoid that going into the future. Even with all the regulation that's put in place, there's still the possibility that this kind of thing can happen again. Right now, personal debt is at a 2007 level, so we're at risk again.
Speaking of like the future of the government and the economy of America, what do you think is the nation's greatest economic concern at the moment?
See that again.
What do you think is our nation's greatest economic concern at the moment, or going into the future?
I think it's kind of a hard one to say. We're doing much better economically. The growth is a little bit slower than it should be, but a lot of it has to do with I wonder if what is the next industrial boom going to be. In the 2000s, it was the dot-com and Silicon Valley. What's the next future? Is it that's going to drive economic growth?
And what do you think should be done to protect the civilians of the United States from debt or financial problems?
I think a lot of that has to do with personal responsibility. A lot of Americans are not responsible with their finances. Now, I know that a lot of Americans are, there's a tough scenario where, Americans the middle class is being challenged with salary stagnation and other issues with their financial well-being. But I think in general, Americans live beyond their means, no matter what that mean is. The average American savings has been at an all-time low for the last 2 decades. It's gotten a little bit better since the recession, but we just don't save. And the last generation didn't do a great job in saving for their retirement.
And how do you think the Great Recession has? Do you think that it taught a lesson to the American citizens? And do you think that they'll reflect heavily upon that lesson, or do you think they'll just kind of let it go down the drain?
Well, I think the lesson has less to do with the individual American and has more to do with how we allow big corporations to manipulate our economic and political situation. And the solution to that, I believe, is to have people letting their politicians know that they're tired of that kind of behavior, and there's been a lot of work to try to modify that behavior. But ultimately, that's what caused the Great Recession. The fact that Americans didn't have, were heavily in debt and had, a light savings background only added to that problem. Right? It wasn't the only problem.
All right. I think that just about wraps it up. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.